Hey, this is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And if you're wanting to learn how to embrace change and navigate through disruption as a leader, then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend, Denis Gianoutsos. He's prepared to ignite.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
Hey there, listeners. Well, welcome to 2025. I want to say thank you for tuning in to the Leadership is Changing podcast. But as we step into a brand new year, I want to take a moment to reflect on the incredible journey we've had in 2024. Over the past year, I've been privileged to feature some amazing guests on this podcast, leaders, change makers, and innovators who shared their wisdom, experiences, and insights. And together we've explored what it means to lead in today's ever-changing world. Over the next month, we're going to bring you some of these highlights. And in the Highlights 2024 episodes, we're bringing you some of the most impactful moments and key takeaways from 2024. Now, these highlights capture the essence of what this podcast is all about, helping leaders like you thrive in times of change and complexity. Now, whether it's tips on being courageous, thinking outside the box, adapting, or navigating transitions to higher levels of leadership, these snippets are sure to inspire and energize you for the year ahead. And of course, these highlights are just the tip of the iceberg. If something resonates with you, I encourage you to go and check out the full interviews from 2024 to dive deeper into the incredible conversations we've had. So let's get into it. Here are the highlights from 2024 on the Leadership is Changing podcast.
There's always that saying out there, I think it's culture eats strategy alive. I think that's the right way of saying it, or how it's said. What do they mean by that, and what are you seeing out there in the market today?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question. So if we think about the things that have evolved over the last few years, we know that there are organizations out there that are performing quite well. So in other words, they're delivering on their strategy. So they have very good sales, they have very good revenue, they have very good profitability. And some organizations aren't performing that well or having difficulty attracting talent or retaining talent. And what we're seeing is that more and more, either people inside organizations or people who are exploring joining an organization, it's not just about the job, it's not just about the pay, but more and more people want to join a culture that has some very specific characteristics where they will be more likely to succeed, as opposed to a culture that's maybe not as positive or as supportive or as tolerant of errors, as an example of cultures that people may not be attracted to.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here, Alex, is that the culture is really, really important. So I think it's really, really important. And so when you say that, Alex, about the culture side of things, I think it's really important because, a lot of people do join organizations, but they leave people. And if the culture isn't right, how does an organization, A, know it's not right, and B, how do they fix it?
Two great questions. So on the first question, I think, and it's interesting, I was having this conversation just a little while ago, and I was saying there's an organization that I was working with where they have a very innovative culture, right? So their culture is quite good in innovation and, developing cutting edge things. And yet, if we looked at, so that was a very positive culture, right? Able to innovate, able to deliver, some very nice product. But then if we looked at the people side of the culture, then the people side of the culture wasn't really following suit. So in fact, there could be parts of a culture that are really positive and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. So I think it's really important that leaders in an organization really take a cold, hard look at current state of affairs. Because I think sometimes because they're focused so much on one part of the culture that's, good and positive and working well, we can easily imagine that, oh, well, the whole culture is good. And in fact, that's usually not the case. So usually there'll be parts of the culture that will be strong and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. If we talk about what can help them do it, well, first of all, is taking a really, really cold, hard look at both the subjective parts of the culture and the objective data. So, for example, cultural surveys or cultural diagnostics or engagement scores or things like that can give us a good indication. But I think actually having conversations with people that are in the culture and maybe people who have left the organization as well. So to not be reticent to talk to people who have left the organization and talk about were there any characteristics of the culture that led them, to move on. And I think it's important at that point, once this cold, hard look has been taken, to really then say, okay, how do we help evolve our culture? Because maybe the culture was good for many years, but with everything that's changing in the environment and in the context and in a whole bunch of industries, it's always important to say, well, how do we continue to evolve our culture so that it's actually going to help us to get where we want to go as opposed to being a hindrance, and that we can attract and retain people so that culture can be that differentiator where people want to join us, not because of what we sell or what we make or what services we provide, but really to be part of a culture that's positive and is allowing people to be themselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about that aspect of cultures now that are becoming more prized.
It's interesting how you talk about the cold, hard look. I think it's the cold, hard look at themselves and they need to look in the mirror. However, Alex, I see sometimes that a lot of organizations tend to put their head in the sand and they sort of want to do a tick in the box type scenario. Oh, yeah, we looked at our culture, but are they willing to do something about it? Because one is to actually get the feedback, two is actually to acknowledge it, but three, which is really important, is to do something about it. Are you seeing a lot of organizations who are just sort of playing lip service to it? And are you seeing those who are actually very serious about it and actually doing something about it? And what kind of results are they getting?
Mm. I think if organizations are really committed to the first part, right, really taking a cold, hard look at, the culture, the current state of the culture, they tend to be more open to the feedback that's generated, right? And to the feedback that's shared. So usually those two will go hand in hand, right? If we're willing to take a cold, hard look, we're more likely then to be open to the data of where we are, culturally. What tends to be a challenge is how do we make things better or how do we evolve the culture? It's not necessarily about the culture being better. It's about being more adapted to where the organization is. And I think I'll give an example in terms of leadership development. And I think a lot of organizations over the past, many, many years have really said, hey, how do we develop our leaders? How do we develop programs to help them become, more strategic thinkers, to help them become, better managers, to help them do business planning, to help them drive results, to help them take on accountability. And that's great, right? And that's really great and really important. And they tend to stop there. But culture tends to live or not live. It tends to live in terms of how people interact with each other, right? Sort of the interpersonal dynamic that happen inside an organization. So those are things like emotional intelligence, right? Empathy, compassion, vulnerability, being open to diversity, psychological safety, so people can be themselves, are not just allowed to be themselves, are actually supported in being themselves and sharing who they are and sharing their knowledge and sharing their experiences. And along with psychological safety, something we don't talk about a lot, and it's a concept that I've been thinking about very recently, that's psychological security. So we could say, yeah, we're psychologically safe and we want people to be themselves and we want people to talk about who they are. But if something happens where a group or a person or a team is not allowed to do that, do we have a security mechanism, so psychological security, to intervene and do something when the safety isn't there? So in other words, can somebody raise the flag and say, hey, thought this was a psychologically safe culture. I actually don't feel comfortable in either sharing something I'm seeing or not allowed to be myself. And then do we have a mechanism for security, for intervention, to do something to kind of bring things back? That's where many organizational cultures tend to not go to that interpersonal dynamic, tend not to create a holistic, psychologically safe environment. And if the safety in the environment is not upheld, there's no security mechanism to intervene. So that's something more and more that people inside organizations and people outside that are thinking about joining the organization are very attuned to.
Hey, look, great to have you here with me. I've already given the audience, or our listeners, I should say, a little bit of an introduction to you, but tell us more about your background. We'd love to know more.
Well, I like to call myself a reformed television broadcaster. I work for the NBC networks in New York, mostly in New York in the US, close to almost 30 years as a reporter, anchor, journalist, show host, you name it, I did everything one could imagine. And I went from that doing a lot of external speaking, doing all kinds of things, out in the world that involved speaking to audiences of many different sorts, to creating my own company where I actually teach people how to communicate. And as you know, every great leader has to communicate and communicate well.
They sure do. If I wasn't nervous before, I'm now nervous when interviewing you, but it's all good. Hey, but you're so right in what you're saying there, that all leaders need to communicate. In fact, some of them are pretty hopeless at it. And so we'll get into it probably a little bit more sooner.
Mm-hmm. Good. I would
Okay.
love that.
Yeah, that'd be good. And I'd love to know a little bit more. So what was it like for you to be in the role that you were doing, anchor, journalist, and things like that, and then to leave that kind of organization to then go into your own business? What was that whole transition like for you?
Well, it's difficult because it was actually a career I loved very much. But I decided, because in the news business and as a journalist, news never takes a holiday. If you don't make air, if you don't make your deadlines, then you can't be good at your job. I just wanted to have a better life and a better lifestyle. And so I got it. But remember that for much of my adult life, I watched history being made before my eyes. And to not be in the center of all of that was very difficult adjustment. And to this day, when I watch something on television or in social media or on my laptop or wherever I am, whenever I see an interview or I read it or I hear it, of course, I'm always thinking, well, why didn't they ask this question? And why did they go down that road? And even more importantly, if we take it to that leadership level, it's why did the person being interviewed answer that way? Why didn't they take it in a different direction? Because they just lost an opportunity.
And an opportunity is like a bird in the hand, right? I mean, it's just a beautiful thing that you could actually capitalize on in the sense of taking that opportunity. And you're so right. And I mean, I don't have the experience that you have, but I can see it actually happening. And I go like, oh, damn, what a great opportunity, but it is lost. Do you miss being out there, as you're saying, seeing history actually being made? Do you miss not being part of it?
Sometimes I do, particularly in very interesting moments when there's some unique, wonderful celebration of something, or when there's a momentous occasion, or when there's an opportunity to actually interview somebody with there's somebody that you admire and that you think of. But what I don't miss are broadcasting the tragedies, broadcasting those moments where you don't know what's going to happen next. Example, I was the first person on the air for the NBC networks on the morning of 9/11. And that was a day that was tremendously hard because, of course, it happened in our backyard in New York City. And we had no idea what was coming next. There was nobody to get information from. I was basically vamping on the air for hours and hours. And in those moments, you know what your job is. It's to be the messenger, to help people stay safe, to do all of that. But in the same time, you're thinking, where's my family? Where are my
Mm.
friends? Those are difficult times. And
Yeah.
that part I don't miss.
Right, right. Because I was going to ask you a question here based on what you just shared there, in the sense that when you're in there and you're in the midst of all that, there's chaos happening, there's so much happening. How do you keep composure? Because you're actually there and people are watching you, and people in the
Mhm.
world are wanting the news, but they're also wanting someone there that's the rock, the person that's actually
Right.
giving. Yeah. So how do you do that? Because it could probably get very quite emotional, I suppose. So how do you hold your composure?
You simply have to. You have to allow, it's almost as, I don't want to call it an out of body experience, but something kicks in that says,
Mm.
and this is important, by the way, for leaders and everybody to think about, is your purpose has to be magnified in your head. It literally has to be all about my purpose in this moment in time is to give information to the world that's watching me so that they can be safe, so that they can know what they need to do, so that they can live, so that they know that they can count on me. And so my purpose is front and center. And once you do that, it takes away everything else.
Amazing. Amazing. That is so cool to hear, and so strong, listeners, because the fact of that is we could be in the midst of something, but it's about actually having control, understanding where you're going. But I love what you just said, is your purpose has to be magnified in your head. You have to know
Mhm.
why you're there, what you're doing, and what your role is. That is so strong. That is very
Yep.
cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Yeah. Excellent. And so you also got to, I see that you've also interviewed presidents and business leaders and things like that?
Oh, sure. I've had, I mean, there have been some magnificent moments. And one of the takeaways for me in starting a communications coaching business was to take what I learned from those people. How did they communicate? And I've taken snippets from every single one of them, what they do right and what they do wrong.
Mm.
And that's helped me learn how to teach people. I mean, I have interviewed in my lifetime. I know you've done, what did you say, about 540 plus podcasts? So I've interviewed hundreds of thousands of people, and some of them in much more probably significant roles than others. But each one of them taught me something, good or bad, they taught me something. And that's what I use every day of my life now.
And that's good. And I think what you're doing is that, as you said before, that you missed the part of making the history, but being out there. But also think now what your role is that you've become that person whereby you're the enabler. You're empowering people by teaching them what you've learned from others and yourself in the past.
Exactly. And it's also a lot of fun. And I'm learning a lot because I work with people from every imaginable industry. And so every single day I learn something new. And some of it's confidential because obviously you have to sign a lot of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, to make sure that I can do the work appropriately and help guide people to be their best and have really clear, succinct messages. But I learned so much. I'm like a jack of all trades because of the information that I've learned.
Yeah. Jen, you know, the other thing is that there are a lot of things that are confidential. And I think there is a lot of things that leaders hear or are part of, but sometimes there is loose lips, and loose lips
Yes,
sink ships. The importance of actually making sure that you keep quiet, because I think that's part of your brand. If you're the person that somebody can say something to you and it's trusted with you and you're a vault, I think it's part of the brand. The importance of leaders doing this and developing that skill. What are your thoughts on that?
absolutely. So loose lips sink ships. And in today's world, with all of the social media that we have, with so-called civilian journalists who report and record anything, it's really difficult to keep things quiet. I do some crisis communications for people, and frequently the reason there's a crisis is because some piece of information has come out before either they were prepared for it to come out, or it might have been something that somebody was trying to keep hidden. Now, I think there's a responsibility to tell the truth and to make sure that if there's information that people need to have, we give it to them, no matter what the cost might be to us. But on the other hand, we have a responsibility to make sure that if we're in the process of maybe building something, creating something, doing something that needs a lot of security, we have to be certain that we keep that information to ourselves, because otherwise it could do great harm.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.